We come this morning to the final 3 verses of the book of Habakkuk, our 7th study in this powerful little book, just 3 chapters long, set around 600 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. Habakkuk's job, you remember, was to be a prophet among the people of God in the land of Judah. And it's fair to say he lived in troubled times. It was a time of political change. It was a time of international turmoil. Under the reign of a wicked king, the people of God were on a slippery slope of sin, sliding into ruin. And Habakkuk's deeply troubled by it all. He's deeply troubled not just at the problems outside Judah, but the problems inside as well. And his prophecy begins by asking the question, why, Lord? Why? Don't you see? Don't you care? Why aren't you doing anything about this, God? And God responds to Habakkuk effectively saying, I do care. I do care, and I care so much, I'm going to do something about it, Habakkuk. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, who will come and exercise judgment on Judah. And that really just perplexes Habakkuk all the more. It raises even more questions for the prophet. And God responds in chapter 2, assuring him that all evil, all wickedness will be punished, but that the righteous will live by faith. And Habakkuk then responds in this chapter, chapter 3, with an amazing prayer. A prayer of reverence, worship. We looked at the opening 16 verses last week. But we come this morning to the final 3 verses. Habakkuk 3, 17 to 19. These are some of the most moving words, some of the most loved words in the whole Bible. We have here some of the strongest and most stirring words of faith you can find anywhere in the Scriptures. Here's Habakkuk, a believer. He's facing testing, troubling times. And he's showing us how to live by faith. He's showing us how to live by faith in troubling times. He's showing us even how a believer can rejoice, even rejoice in troubling times. So it's no exaggeration to say these are gigantic words. These are life-transforming words. Habakkuk 3, 17 to 19. Let's look at them verse by verse, noticing 3 things from this passage. Firstly, a believer imagining the worst. You want to see firstly, verse 17, a believer imagining the worst. Listen to verse 17 again. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flocks be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stall. So we have to understand Habakkuk looking ahead here in his imagination. And he's seeing in his mind's eye the land of Judah, and the nation of Babylon has swept through, and the land of Judah, which, remember, was the land of milk and honey, a land fertile, prosperous. Habakkuk sees Judah being plundered without mercy. He sees it being stripped of all of its assets. And the Babylonian army, they've come, they've taken everything, there's nothing left. Habakkuk says. Nothing. He's imagining a day with no figs, no grapes, no olives. A day with no crops, no flocks, no herds. All plundered, nothing left. Judah. Judah, of all places, stripped of its beauty, stripped of its possessions, stripped of its resources. You can notice there's an increasing severity in this list. Things are bad, but they get worse as he goes down. The first three casualties, they're really our equivalent of luxuries, delicacies, figs, grapes, olives. So no figs to enjoy, no wine to drink, no oil for cooking and lighting. Now, to go without those would be an inconvenience. But life could go on. Life could go on without them. But to have no crops, that was far more serious. To have no sheep, well, that's where their clothing came from. That's where their sacrifices came from. That was their source of meat, really. And to have no cattle, not just a loss of milk, but in those days, you have to think cattle were the equivalent of their heavy machinery. To be without cattle was devastating to an agricultural economy. So they're not only stripped of their luxuries, but their necessities as well. And so this is total disaster kind of stuff. Worst case scenario stuff. Not simply devastated economy. It's worse than that. Everything destroyed. There's a famine here. Starvation, potentially death. One commentator describes it as Bosnia, Vietnam, and Rwanda rolled into one. And Habakkuk is seeing this in his mind's eye, and he is absolutely horrified at the prospect. This is his worst nightmare. A modern day equivalent might be all industry grinding to a halt, the stock market crashing, public transport stopped, no electricity, no running water, terrorists leaving towns and cities in flames, grocery shelves absolutely bare, the agriculture in ruins. You get the picture. Habakkuk is a believer, and he's imagining the worst. Sometimes the life of faith finds itself being turned absolutely upside down. I wonder, what would be your personal worst case scenario? What would turn your life upside down? Maybe for some of us we don't need to imagine, because it's already happened. Loss of health, perhaps. Loss of mobility. Loss of memory. Maybe you can hardly remember what it is to be free from pain or weakness. Maybe you're living with chronic pain, which just can't be relieved effectively. For some of us, it's the loss of a loved one, a husband, a wife, a father, a mother, a child. Where once there was intimacy and companionship, now there's a gap, and there's loneliness and sorrow. Maybe for others, our worst case scenario has come to pass in a marriage falling apart, a relationship breakdown. Or maybe it's being without a life partner altogether. Maybe it's loss of fellowship. Maybe loss of friendship. Maybe loss of income. Maybe your worst nightmare is our current situation, actually, regarding COVID-19. The fact that here we are, weeks away from entering 2022, and it's still here and still dominating life. Maybe some of us were dreading the potential of another lockdown, dreading the whole idea of being cut off once again from friends, family. Maybe some of us, we're seeing the economic devastation coming very close to home of the last couple of years. Now, God, in His mercy, may well protect us from much of this. But sometimes He does call faith to suffer, doesn't He? Sometimes He calls faith to suffer what Paul describes in Philippians, the loss of all things. The loss of all things. Well, how does faith respond in that kind of scenario? How does faith respond when the worst happens? Well, how does Habakkuk respond? Look at verse 18. Let's think secondly. We see here a believer rejoicing in God. That's right, a believer rejoicing in God. He's been imagining the worst. Now he's rejoicing in God. Verse 18, he makes an extraordinary statement. Yet I will rejoice. Though all of this might happen, though all of this is happening, yet I will rejoice. There's a note of determination here. So that even if the worst happens, even if there's famine all around, even if there's Babylonian thugs in the land, even if the cupboards are bare, in the midst of all that, Habakkuk is able to rejoice. Now, how do we explain this? How do we explain this? He has every reason, this man, not to rejoice. Think of the journey that we've seen him in this little prophecy. His circumstances have not changed one iota, really. The nation of Judah, they're still a moral cesspit. The godly are still a tiny remnant. The Babylonians are still being raised up. They're on their way. In chapter 1, he began complaining, questioning. But here he is. Nothing has changed, and he's rejoicing. And we have to understand, this is not a fake it until you make it kind of rejoicing. This isn't a stoic kind of grin and bear it, just get through it kind of attitude. Just tough it out, it'll be okay. No, this is real joy. Real joy. It's a genuine expression of triumph. In the middle of his desperate circumstances, here's a believer. And he's not only able to endure, but he's able to rejoice. Isn't that something? But how? How? Well, notice the location of his joy. Notice the source of his joy. Notice where his joy is rooted. Verse 18. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Do you see? His joy is in the Lord, not in figs. His joy is in the God of his salvation. It's a bit like Paul, we read earlier, Philippians 4, verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. Do you understand? Habakkuk's joy, it's not in his things. It's not in his possession. It's not in his precious cattle and flocks. His joy isn't in the gifts. His joy is in the giver, behind the gifts. And it's such a healthy perspective to have. I mean, if we try to find joy in any created thing or any person, we're ultimately heading for disappointment, aren't we? Because at the end of the day, they can't always deliver when it comes to joy. A new gadget, a new relationship, a new car, a new house might give you a hit of joy for a short time, but it doesn't last, really. It doesn't last indefinitely. It fades far quicker than we imagine. Truth be told, we're foolish to place joy in things because things can be taken away from us. All it takes is a worst-case scenario. We must root. It's vital that we root all our joy in God, in the God of our salvation, the God who sent his Son to seek and save the lost, who sent his Son to lay down his life for sinners, so that even if we lose everything else, we can still rejoice because our joy is invested, it's rooted, it's tied to him. It's not that we don't care about loss, not in the slightest. It's not that we don't grieve over loss. But even with a broken heart, even in spite of all that comes our way, we can have a greater joy. A greater joy. Because no matter what gets taken away from us, nobody can take Christ from us. Nobody can take Christ from the believer. It's a bit like Paul and Silas in the book of Acts, chapter 16. They're in Philippi. They get beaten and stripped and flogged in front of the crowds. They get thrown into prison. Paul and Silas in the prison cell, midnight, and they're singing. They're singing. Friends, only the child of God is able to respond to crisis in that way. We have a source of joy that can never be taken away from us. It's what Jeremiah speaks of. Lamentations 3, verse 24. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. Though everything else might be taken away from you, you've him. You have him. You still have Christ. And friends, Christ is enough. Christ is enough. Psalm 16, verse 2. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. Psalm 73, 25. Whom have I in heaven but you? There is nothing on earth that I desire besides you. Is Christ enough for you this morning? Is he enough for me? I mean, if God was to take everything else away from you, and if he was to leave you with just your faith, would that be okay? Would that be okay for you? Many of you will have heard of Corrie ten Boom. She was a young Christian who, along with her family, helped Jews to escape from the Nazis during World War II. They were caught and arrested. Her family, they were sent to a concentration camp. She survived the terrible ordeal. She was greatly used of God in the years that followed. Towards the end of her life, she said this: you may never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. You may never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. If all we have is Jesus, friends, we have enough. We have enough. Do you believe that? Do I believe that? Habakkuk did. Though the worst should happen, he says, I will rejoice in the Lord. I'll rejoice in the God of my salvation. William Cowper was an English poet and hymn writer. He lived between 1731 and 1800. His life was plagued with years of doubt and despair and depression. And yet listen to how he wrote the following. Though vine nor fig tree neither their wonted fruit shall bear, though all the fields should wither, nor flocks nor herds be there, yet God the same abiding, his praise shall tune my voice, for while in him confiding, I cannot but rejoice. Corrie ten Boom, Paul, Silas, William Cowper, Habakkuk. We want to ask him this morning, how do you do this? How is this possible? Where do we get the faith that you had? How are you so strong? Well, let's think thirdly. A believer strengthened by the Lord. A believer strengthened by the Lord. Verse 19. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. Here's Habakkuk's secret. This is the key to his faith. God the Lord is my strength. And he's confident God will give him the necessary strength he needs. It's interesting, he uses one of the strongest possible names for God in this verse. One of the strongest names in the whole Bible. God the Lord, the sovereign Lord, the Lord God. Notice in the English Standard Version, God written in capital letters. It's the divine name Yahweh, Jehovah, the sovereign, covenant-keeping, almighty Lord. He's my strength, Habakkuk says. That's where my strength comes. Isn't that so helpful? We look at Habakkuk, we think to ourselves, I don't know if I could say that, Habakkuk. I don't think I have that faith. That just seems unreachable for me. To be able to rejoice in that kind of circumstance, I don't think I could ever sincerely say that, we think to ourselves. But listen to him. It's not me, he says. I'm not the strong one. God, the Lord, is my strength. We read Philippians 4, verse 13. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I can be content in any and every circumstance through him who strengthens me. Habakkuk paints a tremendous picture here of God strengthening him. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. Just a few verses earlier, we didn't read, but verse 16, he said that his legs were trembling beneath him. His legs were quivering. And now, strengthened by the Lord, he says, I'm like a sure-footed deer up in the highest of heights. He's describing an animal known for its speed, its agility. We could think of the springbok, the gazelle, the ibex. I don't know if you've seen the Planet Earth episode where they're following this herd of ibex. And they're living on the mountains around the Dead Sea. So actually living around the same territory as Habakkuk was living in. And these ibex, they're able to navigate steep slopes, loose rocks effortlessly. Some of the children, if you've got one of the pages to help you with the sermon this morning, there's a great picture of an ibex for you to colour in. And that's what Habakkuk likens himself to. It's a wonderful picture. It's an image of sure-footedness, untiring energy. God enabling us to do what we think is impossible, to navigate stumbling rocks, loose gravel, triumphing over adversity. So often when we're praying about our circumstances and praying about the future, we're asking, aren't we, for smooth paths, aren't we? We want easy progress. We don't really want trials, tribulations. But there's not much in life that is flat and smooth. More often than not, there are wilderness situations in the life of the believer, and the going can be tough, and the hills can be steep, and the paths can be covered in rocks, and our pains might get worse instead of better, and the pandemic lingers on, and our problems can appear to multiply, even though yet we can rejoice in the Lord, because he makes our feet like hinds' feet, like the feet of an ibex. So maybe rather than praying for smooth paths, maybe our prayer should be for strong feet. Strong feet. Feet to navigate the rough patches of life. Feet to walk the path that he's chosen and prepared for us. Feet that we might walk and tread on high places. That's where Habakkuk gets his faith. That's where Habakkuk gets his strength. He's strengthened not just to stand, not just to cope. He's strengthened to rise above the problem even. To live above his circumstances, if you like. What an amazing journey of faith this man has been on. He begins his prophecy in the valley, and he ends on high places. He begins in fear, and he ends in faith. He begins in doubt and despair, and he ends in confidence and trust. The journey begins in crisis and ends in calm confidence. Wherever you are in your journey, and you are on a journey, wherever you are, let me encourage you, do a Habakkuk. Do a Habakkuk. Remember his name, Habakkuk, one who clings to God. One who wrestles, who holds on to God. Do a Habakkuk. Keep clinging to the Lord. Keep coming to him with all your questions, all your doubts. Keep coming to him through Jesus, his Son. And no matter what sufferings, no matter what losses, Jesus is enough. May God grant us all the faith that no matter what happens, we can rejoice in the Lord. We can take joy in the God of our salvation, because God the Lord is our strength, and he enables us to walk in high places with feet like the deer. Amen.